Of Zephaniah, looking this time at chapter 2, verses 4 through 15. And we're going to look and show that Yahweh's judgment now through Zephaniah switches to Gentiles. To this point, what's Zephaniah given us? Well, he's given us glimpses of worldwide judgment, specifics about which Judeans will come under judgment. That was primarily leadership, remember. The nature of the devastation on the day of Yahweh, and the sliver of hope for escape by repentance. Those last two we saw in the last session. Now Zephaniah is going to turn his attention to God's pronouncement of judgment on Judah's enemies, those enemies that surround her. Outside simply subduing the enemies of his chosen nation, one wonders why God bothers to bring them into the discussions. Well, Israel's enemies were all worshippers of false gods or idols, and that often became snares to Israel, so leading Israel, away from the Lord, from Yahweh. So in getting rid and pronouncing a judgment on those nations, he got rid of some temptation that would confront Israel herself. By defeating the idol worshippers, Yahweh proved his superiority over the false gods. It was a cultural thing then. This says, okay, when I defeat you, it proves that my God is mightier than your God. And so by overcoming one nation and its gods, Yahweh was being glorified as being superior to those nations, to those idols, to those false gods. By the way, all the plagues leading up to the Exodus from Egypt, they serve the same purpose. Each plague displayed Yahweh's superiority over one or more of the Egyptian gods. Eventually got around to essentially proving his superiority over every one of Israel's false gods. Now, moreover, any nation that God uses as a tool in disciplining Israel, however, eventually came under judgment for their atrocities. Each of the nations in the list today fall into that category. You can be a tool to chastise Israel, but when you do it for your own purposes, and you will pay for those purposes. First up, the Philistines on Israel's west side, between Israel and the Mediterranean, and the four main cities that are going to be highlighted or given as case studies: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron. And by the way, they'll be listed from north to south in the order from north to south. Well, let's look at Zephaniah verses 4, 5, 6, and 7. Take this mouthful here to begin our study. And this is all about the Philistines, Philistia. For Gaza, here we start with the cities, for Gaza will be abandoned. Ashkelon will be a desolation. Those two really say almost the same things. Ashdod will be driven out at noon, lunchtime, so somebody's going to come in and surprise you, drive you out. That's Ashdod. And Ekron will be uprooted. So Ashdod will be driven out, Ekron will be uprooted. Again, These are parallel statements. Gaza abandoned, Ashkelon desolate. Ashdod driven out, Ekron uprooted. So, two cities, each having the same consequence. Verse 5, woe to the inhabitants of the seacoast, that would be the Philistines, the nation of Cherethites. There's a strange term for most of us. We don't run into that term, but we'll mention it in a moment. The word of Yahweh is against you, O Canaan, land of the Philistines. And I, that's Yahweh, will destroy you, so that there will be no inhabitant. So the seacoast will be pastures. In spite of those 4 big cities, they're going to be pasture lands now, with caves for shepherds and folds for flocks. That's all that this land will be good for. And the coast will be for the remnant of the house of Judah. Not only that, but he's telling them, look, I'm going to give ownership of that strip of land to Judah. They will pasture on it. There'll be sheep herders on it. In the houses of Ashkelon, they, the Judean remnant, will lie down at evening, for Yahweh their God will care for them and restore their fortune. So in giving the bad news to the Philistines, he's given some relatively good news to Judah. Again, do you remember the parallelism? Gaza and Ashkelon, abandoned, desolate. Ashdod and Ekron, driven out, uprooted. Inhabitants and Cherethites, or Kerethites, I don't know how you pronounce that, actually. So just in case you're looking for geography, as I mentioned earlier, those 4 cities are listed in order from north to south. The term Kerethite refers to the nation, it literally means the nation of the Cretans. And that leads scholars to believe that the homeland, original homeland for the Philistines, was on Crete. So Kerethite is often used as a synonym for the Philistines. Palestine, Philistines. There's a story behind the mix-up of those 2 words, too. Anyhow, the land occupied by the Philistines was, again, a strip along the Mediterranean Sea, and it was to the west of Israel. Gaza Strip, anybody? If you listen to news today? Well, back in verse 5, we see Yahweh's pledge to wipe out the Philistines and leave the heavily populated area desolate. While one hears nothing of modern-day Philistine or Philistia, God promises in verse 7 have not yet been completely fulfilled. The land has not been given over again to Judah and shepherds. So some of that is still remaining to happen. The Philistines were taken out as an opposition to Israel, to Judah, but the complete, so part of that has been fulfilled, but not the complete. Again, we'll be looking for the end times fulfillment of that prophecy. So the heavily populated coastline of the Philistines is to be depopulated to the extent that it will only be supporting animals. Eventually, the region was to become, as we mentioned, the property of the Judean remnant. Care to guess when complete fulfillment will come about? Well, I've already spilled the beans there. It will happen at Christ's return. There used to be a fifth major city of Philistia. Uh, the name most of you will know or recognize. It's Gath, Gath, and it's not mentioned here. Remember, Gath was the home of Goliath, whom David dispatched for improper attitude towards Yahweh. Several other prophets also, in speaking about these times, omitted Gath as a city. Let me read to you Amos 1, verses 6, 7, and 8. Thus says Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4 I will not revoke its punishment, because they deported an entire population to deliver it up to Edom. That was a population of Israelites, by the way, I believe. So I will send fire upon the wall of Gaza, and it will consume her citadels. And I will also cut off the inhabitant from Ashdod, and him who holds a scepter from Ashkelon. I will even unleash my power upon Ekron, and the remnant of the Philistines will perish, says Yahweh, the God of Israel. So notice, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, all said they're going to be taken out by God. And this was a prophecy made to Israel, the northern kingdom, after the split. And Zephaniah is saying roughly the same thing to the southern kingdom, that God will take care of the Philistines. If we go to Zechariah, but notice there was no mention of Gaza there. That was supposed to be my whole point, right? Well, the same point holds here in Zechariah 9, verses 5 and 6. See the listing of the cities again. Ashkelon will see it and be afraid, whatever this destruction is that's coming. Gaza too will writhe in great pain. Also Ekron, for her expectations, has been confounded. Moreover, the king will perish from Gaza, and Ashkelon will not be inhabited, and a mongrel race will dwell in Ashdod. There you are, Gaza, Ekron, Ashkelon, Ashdod. And I will cut off the pride of the Philistines. So Gath is not mentioned there either. Some believe that Gath never recovered from the destruction brought on by an earlier king, Uzziah of Judah. Read about that in 2 Chronicles 26. I'm just going to read verse 6 for you. Now he, that's King Uzziah, went out and warred against the Philistines, broke down the wall of Gath, and the wall of Jabneh, and the wall of Ashdod, and he built cities in the area of Ashdod and among the Philistines. But it doesn't say anything about Gath or Jabneh. So they believe that Gath was never rebuilt by the time of Amos and Zephaniah. So, also, some people believe that Zephaniah was using a wordplay. Gaza is the word Azza, A-Z-Z-A-H. And abandoned was the word Azubah. Azza, Azubah, A-Z-U-B-A-H. So he was saying, Azza will be Azubad. And in Ekron, E-Q-R-O-N, Ekron, uprooted, Tagar. Ekron, Tagar. Ekron, uprooted. And it goes on. He did that with others as well. Did you know that the Philistines were likely the only non-Semitic people in Palestine? They came from Crete, and they are believed to be the offspring of Japheth, not a Semite. Not that the Philistines were out of Japheth, not Shem. Remember, Japheth, Shem, and Ham were the three sons of Noah. Well, next, if I can get untwisted and get back in order here, Zephaniah is going to move from the western side of Israel to those on the eastern side of Israel and Judah, and they would be speaking about the Moabites and the Ammonites. Zephaniah 2:8 through 11. I have heard the taunting of Moab and the revilings of the sons of Ammon. Evidently words, go on, let me finish and it'll tell us what words he's talking about. I have heard the taunting of Moab and the revilings of the sons of Ammon, with which they have taunted my people. That would be Israel, Judah now in particular, and have become arrogant against my people's territory. So, verse 9, therefore, as I live, declares the Lord of hosts, and of course he is a necessary being, so he cannot not live. So he says, I swear by myself, the God of Israel, surely Moab will be like Sodom, and the sons of Ammon like Gomorrah, a place possessed by nettles and salt pits and a perpetual desolation. In other words, he said, I'm going to wipe these guys out, okay? That's what he did with Sodom and Gomorrah and the region around it, right? Burned down sulfur and so forth and destroyed them. So he says, I'm going to do the same thing to Moab and Ammon. The remnant of my people will plunder them. So again, the Judean remnant will plunder Moab and Ammon. This they will have in return for their pride. This is what's coming on them because of their pride. Because they have taunted and become arrogant against the people of the Lord of hosts. Yahweh will be terrifying to them, for he will starve all the gods of the earth, and all the coastlands of the nations will bow down to him, every one from his own place. Says, I don't care where it is, I'll take care of it. So, why are Moab and Ammon linked together? And why the comparison with Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, I think there's a very good reason, is my supposition at least. Both nations came about from incestuous relationships between Lot and his two daughters as they fled the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the destruction brought by God. So, they are going to partake of a destruction similar to Sodom and Gomorrah, because they grew out of the Sodom and Gomorrah episode. Remember, Lot was Abraham's nephew. Lot was the son of Abraham's brother. I forget which brother it was, but we could check that out if we wanted to as well. What are they charged with? Again, improper behavior towards Israel. It goes all the way back to the wilderness wanderings and the time of the judges. In Numbers 22 through 24, the kings of Moab and Midian, another set of cousins, through Midian, Abraham's son with Keturah, his second wife after Sarah died. Numbers 22 and 24, those two kings, Moab and Midian, attempted to have Israel cursed by Balaam. We've talked about Balaam a couple times, and subsequently seduced Israel into idol worship through sexual immorality. During the time of the judges, Ammon and Midian as well were perennial thorns in Israel's side, invading them, plaguing them, marauding, stealing their. That's how we got Gideon involved. They were stealing all of the grain and so forth. So they were typical thorns in Israel's side. And whenever Israel got to the point of not paying attention to God, he would use Midian or Moab or one of the other surrounding nations to punish Israel and bring her back into repentance. But mostly they were bad-mouthing Israel, and they were arrogant about it, and they had their eyes on Israel's land. As a matter of fact, Moab and Ammon occupied parts of Judah during Judah's Babylonian captivity, and they harassed the returning Judeans after the captivity was over. 2 Kings 24, verses 1 and 2. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, who was a good king, became Nebuchadnezzar's servant for 3 years. Then he, Jehoiakim, turned and rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. And the Lord sent against him, against Jehoiakim, bands of Chaldeans, bands of Arameans, bands of Moabites, bands of Ammonites. He sent them against Judah to destroy it according to the word of the Lord. And this was after Nebuchadnezzar had already destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. So afterwards, Jehoiakim was a servant for a while, then he rebelled. When he rebelled, Moabites and Ammonites came in to be marauders in the land of Judah. He sent them against Judah to destroy it according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through his servants, the prophets. He had predicted such would happen. But there was Moab and Ammonites again, and both nations, both tribes or nations were involved in going after Judah, destroying parts of Judah after the captivity was in effect. But in the end, Yahweh will terrify both Ammon and Moab, and the remnant of Judah, as in the case of the Philistines, will dominate both nations and occupy their territories. Interestingly, Yahweh speaks of the false gods and the fact that he will starve them. In other words, they won't have any takers eventually because he's going to wipe them out. Moreover, the peoples who worship those 5 false gods will bow their knee to Yahweh in recognition of his sovereignty. Yahweh always was glorified by his actions. Well, that's reminiscent of what Yahweh did by way of the plagues in Egypt again, something we talked about last time, showing one by one his dominance over every false god on whom that nation relied. So when Yahweh went after a nation, he went after their God to completely destroy its meaning, value, just to completely vanquish any hope of it being a way of delivering the nations. Yahweh says, I'm sovereign, they're not. Live with it. However, verse 11 which talked about taking over the land by Judah and so forth, that still awaits the millennial kingdom for a fulfillment, as do several of the more extensive promises and prophecies from Zephaniah. But Zephaniah doesn't stop there. He goes on to discuss people on its southern border. Now, he went from the west side to the east side. Now he's going south, and some translators call it Ethiopia, some call it Cush. And he's just going to use a one-liner to mention this. Zephaniah 2:12. You also, O Ethiopians, will be slain by my sword. What's he saying? Ethiopia, Cush are going to be wiped out too. Doesn't say exactly how. Sounds like some kind of war. Something that I did not know prior to looking into Zephaniah was that Cush had dominated Egypt at times prior to the destruction of Nebuchadnezzar, because once Nebuchadnezzar finished with Israel, he went on and put an end to Cush's dominance over Egypt. He wiped out or destroyed Cush to some extent. I don't know exactly how sure that was, but evidently at the time Nebuchadnezzar went through this region, Cush no longer could dominate Egypt. We usually think of Egypt as being the dominant nation, but Egypt was second class to Cush at that time. Apparently, whatever Cush's offense was against Judah, we're not told, she was going to pay through warfare somehow. No specific charges are listed, nor any specific method of bringing the consequences given. But we do know that happened with Nebuchadnezzar. Warfare of some sort, apparently, or invasion. Yahweh had predicted such warfare, but the thrust was against Egypt. And you can see that if you wish. I'm going to shortcut us here a minute. I'll just tell you that if you look at Ezekiel chapter 30, verses 22 through 24, you will find another reference to Cush and its dominance over Egypt. But finally, Zephaniah moves north from the southern flank to the northern flank to speak of a judgment on Assyria. Zephaniah 2, verses 13 and 15. He will stretch out his hand, that's Yahweh, against the north and destroy Assyria. This was before Assyria was taken down by a combination of Medes and Babylonians. And he will make Nineveh a desolation. That's where Noah went, or Jonah rather, not Noah. It's where Jonah went and preached, and they repented at that time. But it says now God's going to take Nineveh out so that Nineveh will be parched like wilderness. Nineveh, by the way, was a huge city and was proud of all of its irrigation systems. But Yahweh says it's going to be parched like desert. All the flocks will lie down in her midst, so that's what Nineveh will be good for. It won't be a major bustling city like before. It'll be pasture land, just as the Philistines' land will be. All beasts which range in herds, both the pelican and the hedgehog will lodge in the tops of her, Nineveh's pillars. Birds will sing in the windows. Desolation will be on the threshold, for Yahweh has laid bare the cedar work. This is the exultant city which dwells securely, who says in her heart, I am. That's a dangerous statement. And there's no one besides me. That was Nineveh's claim. I'm like no one else. and she has now how she has become a desolation. That's part of the prophecy, future. A resting place for beasts. Everyone who passes by her will hiss and wave his hands in contempt. So, Assyria had long been the dominant power. It destroyed the northern kingdom in 722 BC. She was arrogant, evil, brutal. Nineveh was cocksure that she could not be taken, but Yahweh spoke otherwise, said that she's going to become desolate like the Philistia. Parched like wilderness may be translated again, dry like the desert, in showing that her system of irrigation won't stop Yahweh from making it desolate. Yahweh just says, no matter, just say what you want. And when she said, I am and there is no other, that was not going to be tolerated by Yahweh. She's essentially saying this city is like a god. The hissing and shaking of the fist again showing contempt, says other people will show contempt at her. Self-sufficiency can be hazarded to your health. Babylon would later learn that too. And if you want to read about that, look at Isaiah 47, verses 8 through 11. Assyria was crushed by a coalition of Babylon and Medes in 609 BC. Nineveh had been destroyed 3 years earlier. Nineveh's demise was interesting. Did you know that she was surrounded by 2 walls, not one, but one wall inside of the other? The outer wall was 50 feet thick and 100 feet high. That seems impregnable, at least in the warfare they had in those days. And between the inner and outer walls, there was enough farmland to support the food needs of the entire city. So she thought, in here, between the 2 walls, I got farmland. I can support myself with food. Even if the outer wall were to fall, I still have the inner wall. But the outer wall, the attack on the outer wall began in 614 BC and was essentially successful in breaching that wall. The inner wall collapsed after a deluge, a big heavy rain, flooded the Tigris, and it overflowed its boundaries and the surrounding region and took out the inner wall. No earthly defense is capable of withstanding Yahweh's decrees. What Yahweh says will happen, will happen. Well, next time we're going to move on to chapter 3 and look at God's particular description of judgment and Jerusalem. We'll look forward to that. We'll see you then. Thank you for being